Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show. Today is a special one because, well, it's inspired by all of you, our amazing listeners.
That's right.
As always, you've suggest the topics, and, we dive deep, do all the research, and then bring you the most valuable insights we can find.
Exactly.
So let's get started, shall we? We've been getting some really, really interesting questions lately.
Okay.
A lot of them seem to be about those kind of hidden influences that can shape how we think, how we act, all
Yeah,
that.
definitely a lot of curiosity about those deeper currents and how people interact.
Absolutely. And that curiosity has led us to a topic that is, well, it's fascinating, but also a little bit unsettling.
I'd say so.
So based on what you all send in, especially those YouTube transcripts from Audiobook Vision, the ones about the secrets of dark psychology and mind control, we're going to dive into the world of, well, what's often called dark psychology.
Yeah, dark psychology is a bit of a catch-all term, but it covers a lot of really interesting ground.
It does, and I think a good way to think about it is like this. We all go through our lives with a sort of surface-level understanding of why people do the things they do.
Right. We see the actions, but not necessarily the motivations behind them.
Exactly. But what if there's a whole other layer underneath that? Like an iceberg, where most of it is hidden underwater, or there are these unseen forces that are subtly influencing our relationships and our decisions. So that's what we're going to try to uncover today.
Precisely. We're going to shine a light on those hidden dynamics and give you the tools to understand how they work.
Right, because the goal here is to, well, first of all, to be able to spot these tactics, to recognize when someone might be trying to influence you in a way that's not exactly straightforward.
Yeah, consider it a form of psychological self-defense, right?
Yeah.
Being able to identify when someone's trying to pull a fast one.
Exactly. But it's also equally important, I think, to understand how these things actually work, the mechanisms behind them.
Absolutely, because when you understand how you're less likely to fall prey to these tactics unwittingly.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's start unpacking some of these concepts. And I think a good place to begin is with covert emotional manipulation.
Oh, CEM. Yeah, that's a big one, and it's something that a lot of people experience without even realizing it.
So for those who aren't familiar with the term, what exactly is covert emotional manipulation?
Well, it's all about influencing someone's thoughts and feelings, but doing it in a sneaky way, often so subtly that the person being manipulated doesn't even realize it's happening.
It's not like someone giving you a direct order. It's more about working on your emotions and how you perceive reality.
Exactly. It's underhanded. It's about control, and it's often disguised as something else.
Now, the audiobook transcripts we looked at, they made a really important distinction between influence and manipulation. What's the key difference there?
Well, influence, at its core, it could be positive. It could be about guiding someone towards a good decision.
Right.
Maybe offering advice as a friend, that kind of thing.
Right, like helping someone make a choice that's ultimately in their best interest.
Exactly. But manipulation, that's about control, secret control.
Yeah.
And it's always driven by the manipulator's own agenda, which might not have anything to do with what's best for you.
So it's really about the intention behind the action that's the dividing line.
Yeah. The motive is key.
Yeah.
Is it about helping the other person, or is it about getting what you want, even if it harms them in the process?
And the transcripts also pointed out that covert emotional manipulation isn't limited to just one area of life. It can pop up in our jobs, our personal relationships, even within families.
Oh, absolutely. It can happen anywhere there are human interactions.
But they specifically highlighted romantic relationships as being potentially the most frequent and damaging. Why is that?
Well, think about it. Romantic relationships are often built on deep emotional investment and vulnerability.
Yeah, you're letting someone into your life in a very intimate way.
Exactly. And that creates a prime environment for manipulators. They can exploit those intense feelings for their own gain.
Because when you're caught up in those strong emotional bonds, it can be harder to see clearly, to recognize when someone's trying to pull your strings.
Absolutely. The lines get blurred, and what might seem like caring behavior can actually be a way to control you.
The audiobooks also talked about these manipulative characters, like the controlling partner or the friend who's a master of guilt trips. What makes them so effective?
Well, they're often very good at tapping into our deepest needs and desires. Our need for love and acceptance, our fear of disappointing others.
Right, those fundamental human needs that we all have.
Exactly. And they become experts at pushing those buttons. They know how to induce guilt, sympathy, obligation, all to get us to do what they want.
And the person on the receiving end might feel those emotions very intensely without realizing where they're really coming from.
Yeah, they might just think, oh, I must be a bad person for not doing this, or I'm so obligated to help them, when in reality they're being manipulated.
So let's dive into some of the specific techniques that these manipulative characters use, the audiobooks. Outlined a few that I found particularly fascinating and maybe a little bit scary. One of them was this cycle of love bombing, followed by positive reinforcement and then intermittent positive reinforcement, or IPR.
Ah, yes, the classic love bombing technique. It's a powerful way to create a strong bond and then use it for control.
So how does it work?
Well, it starts with love bombing, which basically means overwhelming someone with affection. Attention praise right from the get-go.
Like showering them with gifts, compliments, constant attention.
Exactly. It's like being swept off your feet, and it creates this incredibly intense bond. The recipient feels incredibly valued, special.
And then comes the positive reinforcement.
Right. So once that initial bond is established, the
Yeah.
manipulator starts using positive reinforcement to reward the behaviors they want to see again.
So if the person does something the manipulator likes, they get more praise, more attention, more affection.
Exactly. It's all about reinforcing those desired behaviors.
But then things get really interesting with the introduction of IPR, this intermittent positive reinforcement.
Ah, yes. This is where the real mind games begin.
So what happens?
So the manipulator starts withholding that positive reinforcement even when the person is doing what they're supposed to.
So the rewards become unpredictable.
Exactly. And that inconsistency is key because it creates a kind of subconscious craving in the victim. They're constantly seeking that validation, that attention that they got so much of in the beginning.
So they're always trying to please the manipulator without even realizing why.
Exactly. It's like a slot machine. You never know when you're going to win, so you keep pulling that lever, hoping for the jackpot.
That's a great analogy, and it makes it so much easier to understand how someone can get caught in this cycle.
It's a powerful form of manipulation because it operates on a very deep psychological level.
Another technique the audiobooks talked about was reality denial, and it was described as this terrifying feeling of losing your grip on what's real.
Oh, yeah. Reality denial, or gaslighting, as it's often called. It's one of the most insidious forms of manipulation.
Because it makes you question your own sanity.
Exactly. The goal is to undermine your confidence in your own perceptions,
Yeah.
your memories, even your own sanity.
And the audiobook pointed out that it usually starts very subtly, right? It's not like someone immediately trying to rewrite your entire past.
No, it's much more gradual,
Yeah.
much more insidious. They might start by questioning little details, are you sure that's what happened? Or, I don't remember it that way.
So they plant these little seeds of doubt.
Exactly. And over time, those seeds grow, they chip away at your self-trust, and you start to wonder if you can even rely on your own memories.
And the more you doubt yourself, the more you rely on the manipulator for confirmation.
That's the really scary part. It's a vicious cycle that can lead to a complete erosion of your sense of self.
The transcript also emphasized that awareness is armor when it comes to CM. So what are some of the red flags we should be looking out for?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is someone who consistently denies facts or tries to twist reality in their favor. They always have a different version of events.
Right, like they're trying to rewrite history to fit their narrative.
Exactly. And watch out for anyone who uses guilt trips constantly or who punishes you with silence.
Those are classic manipulation tactics.
They are. And that initial rush of overwhelming affection that suddenly fades away, that can also be a warning sign.
It's like they reel you in with all that attention, and then once they have you hooked, they start to withdraw it.
Exactly. And it leaves you feeling confused and desperate to get back to that initial feeling of being so special.
So the bottom line is, if something feels off in a relationship or interaction, trust your instincts.
Don't ignore those gut feelings. They're often trying to tell you something important.
And it can be helpful to document interactions. Write things down or keep a journal.
Yeah, that can help you spot patterns of manipulation that might be hard to see in the moment.
Okay, so we've talked about how our emotions can be manipulated covertly, but let's shift gears now and talk about how people can be persuaded to take actions that might not be in their best interest. And this is where we get into the realm of dark persuasion.
Right. Dark persuasion is like persuasion on steroids. It takes things to a whole other level.
So what's the core difference between ethical persuasion and this darker form?
Well, with ethical persuasion, the goal is to genuinely inform and guide someone. Help them understand something or make a decision that benefits both parties.
It's about open communication and mutual respect.
Exactly. But dark persuasion is all about self-interest or even causing harm to others. It's about getting what you want, even if it means exploiting or deceiving someone.
The audiobook called it the DNA of dark persuasion. It involves these immoral motives, this focus on getting people to act against their own self-interest.
Right, and it often involves a very skilled persuader, someone who can make you believe that you're acting wisely even when you're not.
They make you think it's your idea.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And you walk away feeling like you made a good decision when in reality you've been played.
The transcripts also mention this idea of graduality in dark persuasion, this staircase approach to getting what you want.
Oh yeah, it's a classic tactic.
Yeah.
You start small with seemingly insignificant requests and then gradually escalate the demands.
So you condition the person to say yes.
Exactly. By the time they realize what's happening, they're already in too deep. It's like being slowly boiled alive. You don't realize how hot the water is until it's too late.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of those small, seemingly harmless requests, because they can be the first step down a very dangerous path.
Absolutely. Don't underestimate the power of those initial concessions. They can set the stage for much larger manipulations down the line.
Now, what are some of the ways that dark persuaders disguise their true intentions?
Well, one tactic is to present a really huge request right off the bat, something that you're almost guaranteed to refuse.
And then they come back with a smaller, more reasonable request.
Exactly. And because you've already said no once one, you're more likely to say yes to the second request, even if it's still not in your best interest.
It plays on our desire to compromise.
It does. And they might also use reverse psychology on people who tend to be resistant or contrary.
Yeah.
Tell them to do the opposite of what they actually want.
It's in their leading questions, right?
Yeah. Leading questions are designed to subtly steer you towards a specific answer or conclusion without you even realizing it.
It's a way of planting ideas in your mind.
Exactly. And then there's the law of state transference, which is a bit more subtle.
So how does that work?
Well, it's based on the idea that we naturally mirror the emotions of those around us. If someone's happy, we tend to feel happier too.
Right, it's like emotional contagion.
Exactly. And dark persuaders use that to their advantage. They'll match your emotional state to build rapport, and then they'll subtly shift their own emotions in the direction they want you to go.
And because you're already in sync with them emotionally, you're more likely to follow their lead.
Precisely. It's a way of subtly influencing your feelings and ultimately your decisions without you even realizing it's happening.
So what can we do to protect ourselves from dark persuasion?
Well, first of all, don't rush into decisions when someone's trying to persuade you. Take your time, think things through.
Pause before you act.
Exactly. And question your assumptions. Don't just accept things at face value. Dig a little deeper, consider different perspectives.
And don't be afraid to say no.
Absolutely. Setting clear boundaries is crucial. And trust your gut. If something feels manipulative, it probably is.
Now let's move on to undetected mind control, which sounds like the most subtle form of influence we've discussed so far.
Oh yeah, undetected mind control. It's like the ninja of manipulation. It operates in the shadows, shaping your beliefs and behaviors without you even realizing it.
So it's not about one big dramatic act, it's more about these small calculated maneuvers over time.
Exactly. It's a slow drip, drip, drip of influence that gradually wears down your defenses and reshapes your reality.
The transcript talked about the tactic of finding those in need. Why are people who are emotionally vulnerable or have strong unmet desires more susceptible to this kind of influence?
Well, when you're feeling desperate or lost, you're more likely to grasp at any potential solution or source of comfort.
You're more open to suggestions.
Exactly. Your mind is searching for answers, for a way out of the pain, and that makes you vulnerable to anyone who seems to offer those things.
Like someone who appears to have all the answers?
Right. They might present themselves as a guru, a savior, someone who can magically solve all your problems.
And you're so eager for relief that you don't stop to question their motives or their methods.
Exactly. You're just grateful to have someone who seems to understand and who promises to help.
The subliminal iced tea experiment that was mentioned in the audiobook, that's a great example of how our internal state can influence our choices even subconsciously.
It is in that experiment, people who are thirsty were more likely to choose iced tea after being subliminally exposed to the word tea.
So even though they weren't consciously aware of the message, it still influenced their behavior.
Exactly. It shows how our subconscious mind is constantly processing information and how that information can shape our choices even when we're not aware of it.
Another tactic that was mentioned was restricting choice while creating the illusion of control.
Ah, yes. It's a clever way to get what you want without seeming like you're forcing anything.
So how does it work?
Well, instead of giving someone a real choice, You present them with a limited set of options, all of which lead to the outcome you desire.
So you're giving them the illusion of choice, but really you're steering them towards what you want.
Exactly. It's like those choose-your-own-adventure books where no matter what choice you make, you always end up in the same place.
And the person might feel like they're in control, but really they're just following a script that you've written.
Precisely. It's a subtle but effective way to manipulate someone without them realizing it.
And then there's this idea of interpersonal auditory mind control, which sounds a little bit like science fiction.
Yeah, it definitely has a bit of a sci-fi vibe to it, but the principles behind it are actually quite real.
So what is it all about?
Well, it's about using sounds and language to influence someone's thoughts and behaviors, often without their conscious awareness.
So things like subliminal messages played during sleep or masking words with similar sounding ones.
Exactly. Those are some of the more extreme examples. But the basic idea is that our brains are constantly processing auditory information, even when we're not consciously paying attention.
And that information can have a subtle but powerful influence on our thoughts and actions.
Precisely, it's like planting seeds in the subconscious mind. Those seeds might not sprout immediately, but they can take root and influence our behavior over time.
The American Psycho example that was mentioned in the audiobook, that was pretty disturbing, the idea of someone masking words to implant suggestions.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how auditory cues can be used for manipulation. Whether it's actually happening in real life is debatable, but the concept itself is quite fascinating.
And even if those more extreme examples are rare, the fact that our brains are constantly processing information, even unconsciously, that's pretty significant.
It is. It means that we're always being influenced by the world around us, even when we're not aware of it.
So what can we do to protect ourselves from this kind of subtle influence?
Well, self-awareness is key. Paying attention to your own thoughts and feelings, noticing any unusual patterns or sudden shifts in your beliefs.
And critical thinking, right?
Absolutely. Don't just accept things at face value. Question information, especially if it comes from sources that might have a hidden agenda.
Be a discerning consumer of information.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge authority or conventional wisdom. Sometimes the most dangerous ideas are the ones that everyone seems to agree on.
Let's move on to mind games. Now, the audiobooks describe these as psychological tools used to confuse and destabilize someone, often disguised as harmless teasing or banter.
Mind games. Yeah, they're a common feature of many relationships, but in the context of dark psychology, they're about gaining power and control over someone.
And the victim often doesn't even realize they're being played.
Exactly. They might think it's just a bit of fun or that they're being overly sensitive, but the manipulator is deliberately using these tactics to erode their confidence and their sense of self.
And the transcript mentioned that some people play these games for their own amusement, almost with a sense of detachment.
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling thought, but for some people it's a form of entertainment. They get a kick out of seeing how much they can manipulate and control others.
And for others, it might be a learned behavior. Something they picked up from their family or their environment.
Or they might not even be consciously aware that they're doing it. It's just how they've learned to interact with people.
But regardless of the motivation, the impact on the recipient can be quite damaging.
Absolutely. It can lead to confusion, self-doubt, anxiety, even depression.
So what are some of the specific mind games that we should be aware of?
Well, one that we probably all encounter at some point is playing the victim. Where someone constantly portrays themselves as helpless or wronged.
To gain sympathy and avoid taking responsibility.
Exactly. It's a way of manipulating others into feeling sorry for them and doing things for them.
Then there's triangulation, which involves bringing a third party into the mix to create conflict or jealousy.
Yeah, it's a classic divide and conquer tactic. You pit people against each other to maintain control.
And moving the goalposts, constantly changing expectations so the other person never feels like they can win.
It's a way of keeping someone off balance and dependent on your approval.
And of course, we have gaslighting, again, making someone doubt their own sanity.
It's a particularly insidious mind game because it undermines the victim's fundamental sense of reality.
And finally, there's hard to get, which is often used in romantic relationships.
Yeah, it's about creating this artificial scarcity to increase your perceived value.
So you act aloof and uninterested to make the other person chase after you.
Exactly. It's a way of playing on their insecurities and their desire for validation.
So what can we do to protect ourselves from these mind games?
Well, the first step is to be aware of them.
Oh.
To recognize the patterns and the tactics.
So that you can call them out.
Exactly. And once you've identified the game, you can choose how to respond. You can refuse to play, you can set boundaries, you can walk away.
You don't have to let someone else control your emotions or your behavior.
Exactly. You have the power to choose how you react.
Okay, let's talk about deception. Now, the transcript defined it pretty broadly, encompassing not just outright lies, but also misleading through omission or implication.
Yeah, deception is a multifaceted beast. It's not always about telling bold-faced lies.
Mhm.
It can be much more subtle than that.
And there's this spectrum of deception, right? From those little white lies to much larger, more strategic misinformation campaigns.
Exactly. And the transcript made a really interesting point. They called white lies the gateway drug of deception.
Because they can make us more comfortable with bending the truth, even in small ways.
Precisely. And once we've crossed that line, even in seemingly insignificant ways, it becomes easier to justify bigger and bigger deceptions.
It's like a slippery slope.
It is. And the more we deceive others, the more we erode our own sense of integrity.
And it also undermines trust. You know, if you catch someone in a lie, even a small one, it makes you question everything they say.
Absolutely. It chips away at the foundation of the relationship.
The transcript mentions some common areas where deception occurs, like money relationships, personal feelings. Why are these areas so ripe for manipulation?
Well, those are all areas where trust is essential and where vulnerabilities are often exposed.
Mm.
You know, we're more likely to let our guard down when we're dealing with matters of the heart or our finances.
And manipulators know that they prey on those vulnerabilities.
They do. They might misrepresent their financial situation to get a loan, or they might pretend to have feelings for someone to get something they want.
So it's all about masking their true intentions.
Exactly. And the deceptive tactics themselves can be quite varied. You know, there's the classic outright lie, but there's also withholding information or deflecting blame by accusing the other person of being deceptive.
That's a classic tactic. Turn the tables and make the victim look like the manipulator.
It's a way of creating confusion and doubt, sowing chaos, so that the real manipulator can operate in the shadows.
So how can we protect ourselves from deception?
Well, first of all, be aware of the different forms that deception can take. You know, it's not always about outright lies. It can be much more subtle than that.
Pay attention to the details.
Exactly. And look for inconsistencies in someone's story or behavior. If something doesn't add up, don't be afraid to ask questions.
And trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is.
Absolutely. Don't ignore those red flags.
Now let's talk about hypnotism. The audiobook we referenced aimed to separate the stage magic from the actual psychological techniques involved in influencing someone's mind.
Yeah, right. Hypnotism, it's often portrayed as this mystical mind control power, but in reality, it's a set of techniques that can induce a heightened state of suggestibility.
So it's not about making someone cluck like a chicken. It's about bypassing their conscious critical thinking and planting suggestions directly into their subconscious.
Exactly. It's about accessing those deeper levels of the mind where our beliefs and behaviors are formed.
The transcript talked about several hypnotic tactics like building rapport, inducing a trance state, giving suggestions, and post-hypnotic suggestions. It sounds like a process of gaining trust and then planting ideas.
That initial rapport is crucial because it creates a connection between the hypnotist and the subject, a sense of trust and safety.
And then they use various techniques to induce a trance state, you know, like focusing their attention or using guided imagery.
Exactly. And in that trance state, the subject is more open to suggestion, their critical thinking is relaxed, and the hypnotist can plant ideas or commands directly into their subconscious.
And those suggestions can range from simple things like, you will feel more relaxed, to more complex behavioral prompts.
Right. And what's really interesting is that those suggestions can even be triggered after the hypnotic state has ended through what are called post-hypnotic suggestions.
So it's like programming someone's behavior.
In a way, it is. And the audiobook also talked about seeking and exploiting vulnerability.
So people who are already in a vulnerable state are more susceptible to hypnotic influence?
Absolutely. If someone is grieving or going through a major life change, their defenses are down and they're more open to suggestion.
And the hypnotist can also create situational vulnerability, you know, like by inducing mirroring behavior.
Right. When we mirror someone's behavior, we create a sense of rapport and connection, which can make us more susceptible to their influence.
And they mentioned NLP as a particularly powerful advanced technique.
Yeah, NLP or neuro-linguistic programming, it's a set of techniques for understanding and influencing human behavior.
And it can be used to enhance hypnotic influence.
Exactly. By understanding how people process information and respond to language, NLP practitioners can tailor their communication to be more persuasive, more impactful.
And then there's the 955 rule, which is pretty chilling.
Yeah, the 955 rule, it basically means that the hypnotist maintains a mostly normal interaction, 95% of the time.
So that the 5% of hypnotic influence goes completely unnoticed?
Exactly. It's all about blending in, flying under the radar, so that the subject never suspects they're being manipulated.
Let's move on to brainwashing now, which the transcript emphasized is a much slower and more gradual process than we often see portrayed in movies.
Right? Brainwashing, it's not about snapping your fingers and suddenly controlling someone's mind. It's a much more insidious process.
It's about slowly and systematically breaking down someone's existing beliefs and identity and replacing them with a new set of beliefs that serve the brainwasher's agenda.
Exactly. It's a gradual erosion of the self, a slow drip of indoctrination that can take weeks, months, even years to complete.
And the transcript talked about different brainwashing contexts, like cults, ideologies, even personal relationships.
Right. The goals might differ, but the underlying techniques are often quite similar.
So in a cult, the goal might be to create this new reality, a new normal, where the cult leader is worshipped and their teachings are followed without question.
Exactly. And in an ideology, it might be about instilling unwavering faith in a set of political or religious beliefs.
And in a personal relationship, it might be about gaining complete control over someone's life.
Right. Isolating them from their friends and family, controlling their finances, manipulating their emotions.
The transcript outlined this process of brainwashing, starting with identifying the victim. So who are the prime targets for brainwashing?
Well, brainwashers often target people who are going through a difficult time. People who are grieving or lost or who are searching for meaning and purpose.
Because they're more vulnerable to new ideas and new belief systems.
Exactly. They're looking for answers for a way out of their pain, and brainwashers offer them a ready-made solution.
And then comes building rapport and trust.
Right. The brainwasher will often present themselves as a friend, a mentor, a savior, someone who genuinely cares and wants to help.
And they'll use that trust to slowly start introducing new beliefs and values.
Exactly. It's a gradual process of indoctrination, starting with small, seemingly harmless ideas, and then building up to more extreme beliefs.
And then they start to eliminate critical thinking.
Right. They discourage any kind of questioning or doubt. They want the victim to blindly accept their teachings.
And they create dependence, making the victim reliant on the brainwasher or the group for everything.
Exactly. They isolate them from their old support systems, their family, their friends, so that the only people they can turn to are the members of the cult or the followers of the ideology.
And then they use confusion, overloading the mind with contradictory information.
Right. It's a way of destabilizing the victim's reality, making them question everything they thought they knew.
And then they use repetition, relentlessly drilling the new ideology into their minds.
Over and over again until it becomes the only truth they know.
And of course, there's emotional manipulation, using fear, guilt, love to enforce compliance.
And in some cases, they might even resort to blackmail and control.
Yeah.
Threatening to expose secrets or harm loved ones if the victim tries to leave.
It's a truly horrifying process.
It is. And the saddest part is that by the end of it, the victim often genuinely believes that these brainwashed views are their own.
They've completely lost their sense of self. Their identity has been replaced with the brainwasher's agenda.
And the impact of brainwashing can be devastating.
Right.
People can lose their families, their jobs, their entire lives.
And it can take years of therapy to recover from the trauma.
Absolutely. It's a long and difficult journey.
The audiobook also mentioned this phenomenon of returning to the harmful situation even after escaping, like in Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, it's a strange and disturbing phenomenon,
Yeah.
but it shows just how powerful brainwashing can be. It can create this twisted bond between the victim and the abuser.
Where the victim starts to identify with their captor.
Exactly. And it
Okay.
can make it incredibly difficult to break free.
Let's move on to the dark triad now, which consists of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Ah, yes. The unholy trinity of personality traits.
So can you give us a quick overview of each?
Sure. So narcissism, it's all about an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy.
The narcissist believes they're superior to everyone else.
Exactly. And they crave constant attention and praise.
And they're completely oblivious to the needs and feelings of others.
They are. It's all about them all the time.
Yeah. Then there's Machiavellianism, which is named after the Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli.
Right. Machiavelli, he wrote this book called The Prince, which is basically a guidebook for ruthless rulers.
So Machiavellianism is all about being cunning and manipulative.
Exactly. It's about using any means necessary to achieve your goals, even if it means lying, cheating, or exploiting others.
The ends justify the means.
Precisely. And Machiavellians, they have this very cynical view of human nature. They believe that everyone is motivated by self-interest and that there's no such thing as morality.
And finally, we have psychopathy.
Psychopathy, It's the most extreme and disturbing of the dark triad traits.
Because psychopaths, they lack empathy and remorse.
They do. They're incapable of feeling guilt or shame.
They can be incredibly charming and charismatic, but underneath it all, there's this coldness, a lack of human connection.
And they're often impulsive and irresponsible with a disregard for the consequences of their actions.
The transcripts use some pretty extreme examples to illustrate these traits. Narcissistic dictators, Hitler as a Machiavellian figure, and Ted Bundy as a classic psychopath.
Yeah, those are all textbook examples of how these traits can manifest in really destructive ways.
So like with narcissistic dictators, you see this grandiosity, this need for absolute power, this complete lack of concern for the well-being of their people.
Exactly. They demand adoration. They create these elaborate cults of personality. They rewrite history to make themselves look good.
And Hitler, he's a classic example of Machiavellianism. His rise to power was all about manipulation and deception.
He used propaganda. He exploited people's fears. He played different groups against each other.
He was incredibly strategic in his approach. He had this
Right.
long-term plan, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it.
Even if it meant sacrificing millions of lives.
And then Ted Bundy, he's the quintessential psychopath. He was charming and intelligent, but he was also a cold-blooded killer.
He had absolutely no empathy for his victims. He
Mhm.
saw them as objects to be used and discarded.
And he was incredibly manipulative. He would lure his victims into a false sense of security before attacking them.
And he was a master of deception. He managed to evade capture for years by blending in and appearing normal.
The audiobook also mentions sadism as a potential fourth element in this dark tetrad of personality traits.
Yeah, sadism, it's the enjoyment of inflicting pain and suffering on others.
And it takes the lack of empathy we see in the dark triad to a whole other level.
It suggests that these individuals actually derive pleasure from seeing others suffer.
Which is a pretty disturbing thought.
It's a reminder that there are people out there who simply don't see others as human beings. They see them as playthings, as objects to be used for their own amusement.
Okay, so let's wrap up with dark psychological seduction now.
Right. Seduction, it's a word that often conjures up images of romance and intimacy, but in the context of dark psychology, it takes on a much more sinister meaning.
So what's the difference between ethical seduction and this darker form?
Well, ethical seduction is about mutual attraction and respect. It's about two people coming together willingly and openly.
There's no manipulation, no hidden agendas.
Exactly. It's about genuine connection and shared pleasure.
But dark psychological seduction, it's about control and domination. It's about using charm and manipulation to get what you want from someone, regardless of their feelings or well-being.
It's about seeing people as pawns in your game, using them to satisfy your own ego or your own desires.
The audiobook contrasted the conventional dater with the satisfied seducer, and it seems like the motivations for dark seduction can vary quite a bit.
They can. Some people might do it for the thrill of the conquest. They enjoy the challenge of manipulating someone into falling for them.
And for others, it might be about power. They get off on having control over someone else's emotions.
And for some, it might even be a twisted form of self-development. They see it as a way to hone